Hello everybody, this is a lecture of political thought and today we are going to talk about Karl Marx. Karl Marx is understood to be one of the greatest critics of the Western intellectual thought, and we have discussed this in the last lecture when we talked about Hegel as well, that a major criticism of Lockean liberalism was only provided by Marx's thought, and we're going to deal with that in detail today. We're going to take a brief overview of his life, and then we're going to talk about his philosophy of history and his philosophy of state. When we talk about Marx, we need to understand that his philosophy is grounded on the idea that liberalism and classical economic thought, which was the prevalent economic thought of his time, and liberalism, which was a prevalent political ideology of the time. These two things, according to Marx, defend the interests of the middle classes. So he classifies the society into various classes, various sections, and we're going to go into those details further ahead. But for now, in the introductory part, we just need to know that he talks about how a liberal government and how a classical economic system provides furthers the interests of the middle classes, the class that he identifies as the bourgeois, and it is harming the interest of the proletariat. And these terms we'll define further ahead. We don't need to worry about that right now. What influenced Marx's thought majorly were three things on a broad spectrum or on a broad scale. We know he was a German philosopher, and German idealism and German philosophy of the time was an influence on him. The second major influence on Karl Marx was of the French political thought, and very importantly and very specifically of the French Revolution as such. And the third interest, or the third major influence on Karl Marx, was of the English economists, English classical economists. Why and how these three elements influenced him, we'll just look at that briefly. From German philosophy, Marx is supposed to have borrowed the idea of Hegelian method of dialecticism. We know about Hegel, and we know what dialectic method is, and we know that Hegel applied that dialectic method in the realm of ideas. Marx took up that idealism, took up that dialecticism and applied that in the realm of material world. We'll also go into those details further ahead. Apart from the German philosophy, Marx borrowed from French political thought. From French political thought, he took up the idea from the French Revolution that apocalyptic change was not only necessary but also possible, and it can be brought about by efforts of people, because French Revolution was a manifestation of that change, and that a very major change that would bring about the change in the social order of the world. So this was the second influence on Marx, and the third influence obviously was of the English classical economists who with whose help Marx understood the functioning of the industrial setup and the functioning of capitalism as such, because industrial revolution and capitalism were very nicely articulated by the English classical economists, and Karl Marx understood those terms and those traditions from English classical economists, and then he provided a critique of those. So this is a basic introductory outline of Karl Marx. Now we'll just briefly look at what his life was. Where was he born? He was born in 1818 in a Jewish family in Rhineland, and his father was a rabbi. He studied at University of Bonn and at University of Berlin as well. It was in his student days that he was attracted to the socialist doctrine, and he was expelled from Prussia. He was expelled. He had to go to Paris and settle, go to France, but under Prussian pressure, France also expelled him, and then he spent the rest of his life in England, where he stayed till his death in 1883. His works are extraordinary, and he composed most of them with his fellow comrade Engels, but we don't need to go into the details of every work. The most prominent and the famous works of Karl Marx include the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital, which outline his basic ideals of socialism and communism. Now let's come to the philosophy that is of concern for us, the philosophy and the thought of Karl Marx. There's certain basic principles of Marxian philosophy. One is the idea of alienation, the second is the dialectic method, and the third is the idea of historical materialism and economic determinism. These are the ideals with which his thought is outlined, or these are the very major pillars of his thought. Apart from this, there is also an idea of class struggle and social change that is very deeply ingrained in Marxian thought. We'll go through each of these ideals of Marxian thought step by step. The first is the idea of alienation. Now this is something that is interesting, and this is something that Marx identified very early in his intellectual efforts and intellectual endeavors. For Marx, alienation is to not have something or to not belong somewhere, literally. So in Marx's knowledge, or in Marxist thought, alienation is rooted in historical situation. So when and how a person or an individual is facing alienation, that is rooted and that is caused and that should be understood in his historical situation. And this alienation Marx identifies on three fronts. There are three dimensions that are fundamental to the idea of alienation: man's alienation from nature, man's alienation from humanity, and man's alienation from his own self, from himself. These were the three major doctrines of alienation, and according to the first, man's alienation from the nature, this is understood in context that man is not able to control the world around him. He is not able to change it according to his own wills, and he is alienated from his faculty and capacity of changing the world. In the second aspect, when man is alienated from humanity and fellow workers, we need to understand that man is not the owner of the product of his work. He is doing some work, but that work is not his own. That product of his labor, product of his work is not his own, but it belongs to someone else, and that also causes a kind of alienation in the ideas, or in alienation in man. The third kind of alienation of himself suggests that his own labor, the efforts that he is putting into producing something, or the efforts that he is putting into a work, are also not his own. Those efforts, that labor, that work has also been objectified in a sense, and that objectification of his own efforts, of his own work, of his own labor is also understood as a form of alienation. And it is because of this alienation, according to Marx, that the creative potential of a human being is lost, and he is just reduced to an object, to a step in the production process, and every individual's creativity, his potential to produce, his potential and his uniqueness is lost in this process of alienation, which is happening in the society that we are living in this capitalist society that he criticized. So this is the idea of alienation, because very, very easily it is an inability of a man to realize his potential while being engaged in the process of creation. So he's not doing what his heart desires. He's just putting in his labor and bringing out a product which might not be to his own fulfillment. So this is the kind of alienation that we need to understand. But the more central idea of Marxian philosophy and of Marxian historical thought is the idea of dialectics. We've already talked about dialectics when we discussed Hegel. We know what dialectics is. Dialectics is coming together of two contradictory, sometimes opposing ideas, and their clash with each other for the production of a new one, which according to Hegel was thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. That is the creation of a new idea which eventually would become a thesis. Now Hegel applied this idea of dialectic in the realm of ideas, but Marx took up that dialectic method and applied it in the realm of material world where there are forces of production. We'll come into those details further ahead. What Marx took up from Hegel was that there was a constant movement from one point in time to another. There's a constant movement from one point to another through a dialectic process, through the process that Hegel identified, where there is a thesis, there's an antithesis, and there's a synthesis. So this is the basic idea that Marx borrowed, and Marx asserted, and he also borrowed the idea and changed it a bit. On what fronts did he change it? He changed and asserted that dialectic process is a process of the real world and not of the ideal world. That process is a process of social change instead of intellectual change. That process is a process of matter instead of mind. So this is the change that that Marx brought about in the Hegelian idea of dialecticism. And Marx holds that material and the ideal world are not only different but contradictory from each other, and he asserted that the material world is the primary world instead of the ideal world or the world of the mind. This notion or this idea will lead us into his second important philosophical, or the third important philosophical dimension that we are looking at, that is the idea of historical materialism and economic determinism. This idea that material world is the primary mover, material world is the primary thing, and everything else comes later, is a very important element of Marxian thought as well. Marx understood historical materialism, or he explained historical materialism in the terms that ultimate cause that determines the entire human history is the change in the development of society and the change in the economic aspects of a particular society. And that economic change in any historical age, in any historical epoch, would lead to certain other changes, and those changes would be a reflection of the economic change. So according to historical materialism, economic change comes first and every other change comes later. Every other change will include the change in thought process, change in the social, change in the political setup, change in ideas, change in any other thing, fashion industry, change in clothing, change in culture. Everything else will come after the change in economic front, change on economic front. So this was his idea of historical materialism, and according to him, the whole course of human history could be explained in terms of changes occurring in the modes of production. And this is his materialistic philosophy of history, or what we know as historical materialism. And now when he talks about mode of production, we need to look at that in detail a bit, because that is something very important in Marxian thought. We have already looked at how he says, or he explains, Marx explains that mode of production is the base and everything else is a superstructure. So the change that are brought about in the economic front, that he understood as the mode of production, is the basis, and the changes in other things, like the changes in the political setup, cultural setup, and every other thing, thought is a after effect of the change in the economic setup. And this he identifies as base and superstructure, with economic changes and economic setup as the base and everything else as a superstructure. And that superstructure consists of the state, the law, the government, the art, the culture, the philosophy. Everything will come under superstructure, and the base would include the economic changes, and those economic changes those economic aspects he calls mode of production. And in this mode of production there are two elements, means of production and relations of production. We don't have to go into the details of these, we just need to have a brief overview of what this means. Means of production, as the name suggests, would mean the raw material, the machinery, the things that are in place to bring about production process. Because we need to understand that Marx is living in a world where industrial revolution has already happened, and industrial revolution has brought about very major changes which are affecting the thought of Marx. And that is why he looks at everything in the context of the production process. And economic setup of the time Marx is writing in is strongly hinged on the industrial production and industries, and that is why we see these kind of terms and these kind of explanations that is provided regarding economic setup. So mode of production includes means of production and relations of production. Means of production includes raw material, machinery, setup, etc., etc. Relations of production include the relationship that is there between the producers, the people who are making the, who are owning the production setup, and the workers who are providing their labor, providing their efforts to bring about this production. So this is a brief outline of what means of production and what relations of production are, and these both combined constitute the mode of production. We just need to know this much. So this is his idea of the economy and the economic causes being the primary mover and everything else being secondary. And this is also understood to be as economic determinism, which means that economic aspects are the determining factors, are the crucial factors in any changes that are brought about in the superstructure, in the state, in the society, in law, in culture, in philosophy. So this is economic determinism, where economic changes are the base. They're the basic factor. Further ahead, he classified history into 5 stages according to the economic development that were happening at that time. He looked at history into 5 stages. First was the primitive communism. Second was slave mode of production, in which slaves were the main producers. This was the Greek city-states, and etc. There were slaves and slave owners, the two classes, the exploiters and the exploited. And then we have feudalism, feudal mode of production. In feudalism, we had serfs and feudal lords, serfs being the exploited and feudal lords being the exploiters. Then we have capitalism. Capitalism is the setup that he was living in, where there were bourgeoisie or middle classes, or the owners of the factories, owners of the means of production, and the oppressed, which were the proletariat. So these were the two classes of capitalism which were in contradiction with each other. And then there was communism, which was the 5th stage. So these were the 5 stages of development of a human society. And according to Marx, the 5th state, or the stage of communism, would be a classless, stateless society without any struggle. This was his notion. And according to Marxian thought, each of these stages, except the final one, obviously except communism, there were forces of contradiction which made revolutions inevitable. There were antagonistic groups which whose interests were not matching each other's interests, and they were fighting, and when they fought, thus produced that fight and that clash produced a new economic stage, or a new stage in the course of history. So this was his idea of historical materialism and economic determinism, where historical materialism, which means that every historical stage changes and is defined by a basic economic setup, like slave mode of production, like feudal mode of production, like capitalism. And economic determinism means that every change in the society, every change in the culture is initiated or is furthered or is caused by the change in the economic setup. Now, having understood this, these were the very major aspects of Marxian thought and his philosophy of history. Now, as we've already seen, that he argues that there would be a class struggle that would go on between the groups in any historical epoch and in any historical stage. Thus, he talks about a philosophy of class struggle and social change, where in every historical epoch that we have seen, from slave mode of production to capitalism, there would be two classes, the rich and the poor, the owners of the means of production and the ones who sold labor, the haves and the have-nots. So this is his prime understanding, where there is a division in society on the basis, there were two groups in every society that exist since time immemorial, since the beginning of history, and these two groups can have different names, and the relations of productions can be in different can be in different measure, can be in different shapes, and differences will be there, but the basic ideal remains the same, that is of contradiction between these two groups in every historical epoch. And between these two classes in any historical epoch, there would be a struggle, there would be a clash of interest, and then that clash would lead to the next stage. For example, in the slave mode of production, the contradiction and the tussle between the slaves and the slave owners led to the rise of feudal order, and further ahead, from feudal setup, the clash between the feudal lords and the serfs led to the creation of capitalistic society. So this is his idea that is there, and he argues that any setup, for example capitalism, it would the antithesis or the contradiction to the basic idea. For example, if capitalism is the basic idea, the contradiction of this basic idea would be there within the setup. So they would nurture their own grave diggers, according to Marx, and when a particular point would be reached, the balance would be disrupted, there would be a clash, and there would be a new society, a new economic setup that would emerge. In his formulation, capitalism was the last stage, and which was the epoch where Marx lived. And just to briefly understand what economically capitalism means, capitalism was defined by Marx on two factors. One was the use of wage labor, and the other was the presence of private property and private ownership. What does the first one mean? The use of wage labor means that the owners of the means of production, that means the producers, the industrial producers, and the people who are working in that industry, they meet in a market, and the worker sells his labor to the industrialist, and the industrialist provides a wage to the worker. So this is the idea of the presence of wage labor in a capitalistic society. The private ownership, according to him, means the private ownership of the means of production, the private ownership of the industries, private ownership of the machinery, not the private ownership of the personal property, house, home, household effects, etc. These are not the private property that he's talking about that are characteristic of a capitalistic society. The characteristic of a capitalistic society is the private ownership of the industries, private ownership of the means of production. So this is his idea of capitalism, and then there's a struggle that goes on between the middle classes in the capitalist society, whom he calls bourgeoisie, and the workers in the industrial society or capitalistic society, whom he calls the proletariat, and the contradiction between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie will bring about a new world. Right? This is his ideology, his philosophy of history, as much as we need to know about it. Now we'll just briefly look at his idea of state. For Marx, state was an instrument of dominant economic class. So now there's always a dominant economic class and a subversive economic class or submissive economic class. And the dominant economic class is using the state to further its own interest, its own ends, and it is using the state to further the oppression in the society that the state is functioning in. The state, despite any form of government, does not, according to Marx, represent universal interest, which suggests that it does not represent interest of the majority of the people or the interest of all the people. So the state does not serve the interest of the universal order or universal individuals. It does not serve the universal interest. And regardless of the form of government, state was an evil according to Marx, and it was a product of society which has gone through a class struggle and which has to go through another class struggle. So this was his idea of state, states that he knew in his world, and each mode of production, according to him, each economic base would produce a kind of a state, and that political organization would be a superstructure. State would be a superstructure, we know that, and the economic changes and economic relations would be the base, and each political setup, no matter what shape and what dimension it takes, it would be beneficial, it would be useful for the oppressors, it would be furthering the oppressor's cause, and it would be an evil according to Marxian thought. State in any form and in any political dimension. And the alternative that Marx thought and that Marx argued for and worked for was a classless and stateless society in which there would be true democracy, because there would be involvement of all the people on a whole, and not only of the economically superior class. So this was the alternative that Marx suggested. His ideal society was a stateless society as such. When we talk about state, we cannot forget about the term that Marx uses for dictatorial despotic regimes of his time. He uses the term Bonapartism, and he explains this kind of state or this kind of political setup which emerges in a capitalistic society as a as a realm or as a political setup in which the capitalists have already lost, but the proletariat have not yet won. The industrialists have already lost, but the working classes have not yet won. And when this situation emerges, there is the rise of dictatorial despotic power, where executive branch of the state under the rule of one individual attains dictatorial powers over all the other aspects and parts of the state and the society. And an example of Bonapartist regime, according to Marx, was the rule of Louis Bonaparte, who was the nephew of Napoleon I, and he grabbed power and became an emperor, and he fashioned himself as Napoleon III after he brought about a coup, and it was in December 1851 that this happened. And there's also a parallel that Marx sees in the rule of Bismarck in Germany. So these kind of rules where there is a dictatorial despotic regime in the control of one individual is something that is termed as Bonapartism by Marx. And Bonapartism, as I've already told you, was a result of a situation where the ruling class in capitalistic society was no longer in position to maintain its rule, but the working classes is not able to wrestle the power and the control for itself. The working classes have not been able to grab the power for themselves, and it is a situation of an equilibrium between the two classes, equilibrium between the oppressed and the oppressor. This Bonapartism, however, is not a step ahead in Marxian philosophy. It is merely a equilibrium that is established, and it gives strength to the oppressor, to the capitalistic elements, and then they again rise up and establish their own supremacy in the realm of state. This is more or less what we know about, what we need to know about Marxian state and his conception of state. We need to just briefly look at one more aspect of Marxian thought, that is the idea of dictatorship of the proletariat. We know what proletariat, who proletariat are, and this step or this aspect of dictatorship of the proletariat is seen by scholars as a step of transition from the capitalistic society to a purely socialist communist society where there is no state and no class as such. And this is understood as an intermediate point, as a point of transition from capitalism to socialism and communism, in which there would be a rule by the proletariat who would seize power after bringing about the downfall of the capitalistic society. So this aspect of the dictatorship of the proletariat is not in the present realm, it is in the realm of the future. It is the upcoming setup that Marx speculates or Marx argues for. This is something that is about to happen. This is something that the process of history would bring about according to Marxian thought. It is something that does not have an existence in the present world as such. And the society that would be produced after this transitional phase, after the transition from capitalistic world or the capitalist society to a communist society, that would be a society that would be a society of associated producers. People would live in a society where they would not be alienated from their products, they would not be alienated from nature, they would not be alienated from humanity, they would not be alienated from themselves. So that would be the ideal society, the society that would come into existence after the class struggle has played itself out in the course of history. This is the idea that is there in Marxian thought, and this is what we need to know about the Marxian thought. And Marxian thought looks at communism or a communist society as the final solution to the process of history. And in a communist society, in communism, man will become conscious of himself. He would not be just an element, just an object in a large historical process, but he would become a conscious individual, conscious of his own self and conscious of his own potential, and hence he would not be alienated on any front. So this is his thought, this is his ideology, and this is what we need to know about Marxian historical thought and his political philosophy. Thank you.